Hi, we'd like to welcome everybody to Human Trafficking Exposed, Protecting Your Supply Chain with Data and Analytics. Prior to beginning, I need to share my screen because there are a few people who are having issues accessing the phone dial-in numbers. So if you just give me a moment, I'm going to pull up the dial-in numbers and share my screen so that everybody can see. It is not letting me. Okay. So I apologize. I'm hoping that somebody can have that happen. Okay. I'm sure they'll figure it out through live support. I apologize. Welcome to Dun & Bradstreet's webinar, Human Trafficking Exposed, Protecting Your Supply Chain with Data and Analytics. I would like to take a few minutes to thank you for making the time to attend this webinar on a very important topic, ending modern slavery in our supply chain. My name is Kristen Selecki, and I am the Global Marketing Leader for Supply Management Solutions at Dun & Bradstreet. I'll be moderating today's panel. A few general housekeeping notes. We will be recording the session, and you will receive an email post-event with a link to the recording in case you want to view it again or share it with a coworker. Also, we are asking that you submit all questions through the Q&A box to the side. If we don't have time to answer your questions, we will compile the responses to all the questions and email to all of you the full list with responses post-call. Before we get started with our presentation, the panelists would like to get to know you a little. So we have a few questions for you. In a moment, a polling box will pop up, and we'd like you to answer the question for us so that we can get to know you. The first question is, do you have a formal program in place to combat modern slavery in your supply chain? And everyone should be able to answer. A 100% don't know. Okay. We'll give it a few more seconds for responses to come in. Getting a few more now. Okay, the majority don't know. Oh, no. Okay, this is good. Most are no, and I don't know. Okay. I'm going to stop. Oh, there's more. Okay. Some is yes. Some people aren't seeing the poll. Okay, there should, I'm not sure why you didn't see a pop-up. Or it looks like it's popping up now for some because the questions are updating. I apologize. What we will do is, the question was, do you have a formal program in place to combat modern slavery in your supply chain? One of the audience is asking again. Okay, it looks like most of them are no or I don't know. And thank you for answering in the questions section. I appreciate that. Okay, what we'll do is I'm going to try one more question, and if it doesn't work, I won't waste our time or yours with this, and we'll go through it. But I'll stop the voting on this one, and I'll pop up the next one, and we'll go from there. The next question is, if you don't, your company plans to put a formal program in place, and if you have one, that is an option. So I'm going to start the voting. A pop-up should appear. And the options were more than 12 months, within 6 to 12 months, within 3 to 6 months, you already have one in place, or you're unaware of when or if you plan to have one. Responses are coming faster for this one at least. Okay, a few of you have within 6 to 12 months, already have one in place, or unaware. And all you see is, okay, and there are still people not seeing it, and some people are answering here. That's perfect. So it looks like we have a fair range of people with these questions, and so what we'll do is I'm not going to waste any more time with polling, even though we did have a few more questions, but if it's not working correctly in the system, we'll look into it and make sure that it's set up. I just got a note. If you're on full screen, you will not get the pop-up. So if you're in regular view, you will get the pop-up on the presentation. Or your pop-up blocker could be blocking it. So those are two reasons that it's possible that it didn't happen, and so that you may not see your pop-up. Just want to let you know that that's what they said. Okay, we'll stop the voting on this one. But this is a good sample. It tells us really that there's interest in it, that there are people that are there. And during this session, you're going to have the chance to hear from a panel of industry experts around combating human trafficking within your supply chain, and all the reasons that they're doing it in themselves. So what I want to do is just take a few minutes to introduce the panel to you and then get started with the presentation. Our first speaker is Phil Berry. Phil is joining us actually from China today. And Phil is the former Director of Sustainability for both Nike and Stora Enso. With Stora Enso, Phil led the development of a world-class human rights, environmental, and stakeholder engagement program for Stora Enso's largest and most complex emerging market investment, which is China, which is why he's there. Before that, he did consulted globally on human rights and supply chain issues for large U.S., U.K., and Asian clients. And then before that, he spent 11 years at Nike, where he founded and led Nike Footwear's supply chain sustainability program and was the first director of sustainability. Currently, Phil and his wife are relocating back from China to Oregon, and we're glad that he's taking the time late at night to come and join and help show us what he has done. Phil is joined by Mike McConnell. Mike has been with Intel for over 20 years and managed financial analysis, planning, management, and controls in the finance organization for over a decade. He's based in the U.S. as well as in the U.K., and his experience includes both supplier and customer assessment, and for the past 5 years, he has focused on helping to manage the supply chain sustainability organization. He represented Intel on several Electronic Industry Coalition, EICC, working groups, and he is also based in Oregon. Paul LaRose is the co-chair of Perkin Coy's LLP's Supply Chain Compliance and Corporate Social Responsibility Practice Group. This is the first such dedicated practice amongst the largest law firms in the United States. He's an authority in product distribution, having worked closely with and in the legal departments of several multinational and mid-market companies. Paul's unique background and insight allow him to counsel clients on the rapidly expanding supply chain laws. A former CPA, he has significant audit and compliance experience and was introduced to me as a senior advisor to the Trownie Foundation, which is the global UN-accredited organization to end slavery and human trafficking that was founded by Trong and Ronnie Hong, who are both child victims of modern slavery. Paul is joined by my counterpart at Dun & Bradstreet, Jeff Farrell. Jeff leads Dun & Bradstreet's global team of supply management solution advisors. He brings over 20 years of experience advising global procurement organizations and governments on enhancing the value of their data, reducing category costs, managing supply chain risk, gaining process efficiencies, and increasing working capital through innovative technology and advanced analytics. And last but not least, Venus Rodriguez. Venus currently leads the Reinvent program for Not for Sale, aimed at helping women and children who are survivors of human trafficking make a fresh start. She has 14 years of experience as a well-recognized youth organizer, having previously been named as a top 25 organizer under 25. And I'd like to thank them all for taking the time to join us here on the panel. Let's begin the discussion by establishing truly how big a problem modern slavery is. For that, I'm going to hand it off over to Phil Berry. And Phil, please take us through forced labor and human trafficking in the corporate supply chain.
Good morning. I guess it's also good afternoon and good evening, depending on where we all are. The issue that waiting for the to advance. Okay, there's a bit of a delay. So, talk about a little why we all need to care about this. I mean, first of all, regardless of what your supply chain looks like, there's a lot of people in it, depending different kinds of industry, different kinds of size businesses. This particular picture is looking across an apparel stitching center with about 3,800 people approximately on one side. It's a bridge. If you turn around and look the other way, there's another side to the factory that's the same size. So what we have is about 7,500 people under the same roof. I mean, mostly women. What human rights professionals would probably call a vulnerable population. So we wind up having is this large grouping of people who might be migrant workers. They might not be migrant workers. They might be in industrial facilities, but it's the number of people that we're dealing with in factories, and then in a more dispersed setting potentially when we're looking at agricultural supply chains. This is one of my team members interviewing women in a forestry operation in China. Actually, one of my former team members. I've left that company, but the point is, whether you've got an industrial supply chain, an agricultural component, maybe you have both. Everyone has some version of a packaging supply chain. If it's a paper packaging supply chain, maybe it's tier 2 or tier 3, but you've got a forestry operation in there. And what we wind up with is an awful lot of people in situations where we have, let's say, limited ability to monitor. Certainly tier 1, tier 2, we get to tier 2 and tier 3, we get in a position where it's likely that there's forced labor, prison labor, child labor, possibly slave labor. I mean, I've rarely looked at a second tier of a complex supply chain and not found forced labor. So if you aren't fighting against it, you probably have it. Even if you're fighting against it, you might still have it, but at least if you're fighting against it, what you've got is an arguable case that you're addressing it. And Paul will talk more about the legal ramifications, but one of the reasons that we all need to care is just the expanding nature of the legal requirements globally, but certainly in UK, EU, United States. And this isn't even a complete list. So it's not going to back off. It's not going to get easier. It's not going to get less complicated. It's time to begin to, as the poll seems to indicate, that people are beginning to give consideration to and putting programs together, and that's really what we need to be doing. So specific reasons that we need to be paying attention to, or specific reasons that we need to pay attention to the subject. I'm a baby boomer. My eldest daughter is Generation X. My youngest daughter is a millennial. We get in a room to talk about this because they both do social work. There's really different versions of what they're willing to tolerate. If millennials aren't your customers now, they will be in 10 years because it's the nature of the economy is that as younger people are becoming a larger portion of your business, of your customers, of your shareholders, of your investors, of your stakeholders in general, they have a lot less tolerance than some of the people like me do for just say inactivity, but mistakes. The social issues related to the way millennials look at things is not the same thing. And then the tools. Obviously, social media. I mean, this is old news to probably everybody on this call. But when you think about this in terms of the enablement of people in your supply chain to register complaints about the way they're being treated without talking to you, this becomes an enormous risk, or I would say potential opportunity, because you can get them to talk to you, obviously, and talk a little bit more about that in just a sec. that vulnerable people have a lot more power than they know. I deal with vulnerable populations in China on a daily basis in a job that I've been doing here for 3 years, and they're catching on. They're starting to realize that they can use social media for their own benefit. And then I would say, lastly, I mean, second chances aren't, kind of back to the way millennials look at this issue, second chances are not as likely to be given in the management of human rights issues, especially in the management of vulnerable people. If you're talking about child labor, forced labor involving women, forced labor involving women does get looked at differently than forced labor involving men. It may not be fair, but it is true. So as you look at the issues, you're more likely to be forgiven for an environmental misstep than you are for a social misstep that involves people who have a very difficult time defending themselves. Then talk about a little bit about how we in companies are fighting forced labor. I mean, this is complicated, difficult work. Currently, the efforts that companies that I work with and have worked with over the past number of years, it's relatively piecemeal. I mean, these are, I say, the 9 most common things that I find that people are doing. And everybody's doing some combination of these. But the issue that comes up is that they're underpinned by what I consider to be a mistake, and that mistake is that it's viewed as risk without opportunity, and that there's a general lack of focus. We're worried about compliance with the regulations. We're not worried about necessarily looking at people's lives and how we can help them versus what risk they pose to our corporate entity. So as we talk about it, I'm not going to go through these specifically, but the bottom half of this, cross-industry collaboration, there can be a problem associated with it when this is all that you do. If you do something with those first 4 and then a little bit of cross-industry collaboration, that's rarely an agenda for leadership. Supplier capacity building is a great thing to be doing. NGO partnerships can be a terrific thing to do. But the problems that exist is that, once again, these are dealt with as an issue of risk. And I think the last one on the list, number 9 here, social and ethical audits, it really illustrate the approach or the road that we've gone down that I think is not the proper strategy for addressing the issue. Social and ethical audits don't work. It doesn't make me popular with the social and ethical auditing community, but I'd be happy to send anybody who just gives me their email a couple of scientific reports from academics that have done great studies showing that it really isn't effective. And part of the reason for that, as you get into environmental issues, yes, the issues are in the factory. We can audit them, we can see them. When you get into social issues, and even more so when you get out of labor issues and get into the broader human rights issues, such as security issues, and how a supplier might be dealing with security issues, which would be a potential problem under one of the UK Anti-Bribery Act or any variety of American laws. Point being that those impacts are not in the factory. So you send someone in to do an audit inside the factory on a social and ethical issue, and the social and ethical impacts are outside the factory. Obviously, you're not going to find them, and you can't blame the auditor for that. It's just the wrong tool. So what business should be doing? One, this isn't the only thing, obviously, but changing the point of view. People are not risks. They're assets. They're a resource. When we're looking at people in whether this is in a supply chain in China, whether it's somewhere in Southeast Asia, whether it's India, or whether it's your own backyard in your owned operations, we can't be dealing with this as just as a risk issue. What we have to be doing is setting up a system where we're analyzing what the actual impacts are, and I'm not talking about supply chain mapping here. I'm talking about an understanding of an approach to value as well as the legal risk. Yeah, we're not going to get away from the legal risk, but there is value in this. There are things that you can be doing that actually harness the ability of people in your supply chain to actually give you information about the honesty of your suppliers and the way that they actually behave. You can trust these people if you build a relationship with them. And by these people, I'm talking about both your employees, contract employees, and people outside the factory in the community. I mean, the community benefits from having the supplier there. And the way we talk about it in human rights is really unfortunate. We talk about it as a grievance channel, a very legal name for it. But really, this is just about engaging with and listening to people in your supply chain. Certainly in Tier 1, but Tier 2 and Tier 3, you can get more information out of the people who are in the community around your factory than you can out of the factory. Maybe different kind of information, but I tend to trust what people in the community tell me more than I trust what some of the factory people tell me. And then knowing where the risk exists in your business. This is not talking about supply chain mapping. This is talking about using the first two sections on this slide, looking at its value as well as risk, engaging with people, coming up with risks based partly upon what the issues are that you find in the conversation with the people both inside the factory and outside the factory, but also based upon the other issues that you would normally look at in prioritization, that you're looking at issues related to the type of industry, the type of supplier that you're dealing with, and other things that your other parts of your company tell you about the supplier. What does quality say about them? If they lie on quality, they definitely are more likely to lie on issues such as human rights. And then, if it moves, yeah. And then I know this is possibly the least likely, one of the more controversial things that I say every time I talk to clients or companies that I come into contact with. Stop auditing to try to find labor and human rights issues and impacts. It doesn't work. It can't work. You need to work more within your own organization, less through third parties. You can get to the point later where you engage auditors, and get to the point later where you engage NGOs. But you need to get your own act together before you get out and start to look at this as something that the world has something that can be audited. And I think that does it. So this is Paul, if I'm not mistaken.
Thanks, Bill. Actually, we're going to hand it off to Mike, and Mike is going. Is it Paul? No, it's Paul. Yes, Paul for the regulatory consideration.
Thanks, Chris. Chris, I'll need your help with the slides here.
Well, I'll be glad to.
Thank you so much. So, hello everybody. I've been tasked with giving a brief description, really a big overview of 4 different laws, just to help everybody here understand where regulations are headed. And 2 of the laws are basically reporting statutes. One is the California Transparency of Supply Chains Act. The other, the UK Modern Slavery Act. The third law is actually a set of federal acquisition regulations here in the U.S. for U.S. government contractors. And the fourth act is the U.S. Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act, which has recently been enacted and is given much more power to the government to seize goods coming into the country that may be touched by prison or forced labor. So I know as a panel, we really want you to keep in mind what's required with these laws, because we want you to stay ahead of them. You know, as more and more laws are being passed around the world, it's important not to be simply reacting, but stay ahead. See where you are so that when new laws are passed, you're already there. Okay, so maybe if you go to the first slide of the definition of human trafficking. So we're all on the same page. Human trafficking, the U.S. definition, is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. So note that there are 3 elements required for human trafficking to occur. There has to be an act, which you see in the, what used to be red, it's kind of a weird purple color. The darker blue, there must be the means, it's force, use of force, fraud, or coercion, and for the purpose of actually putting somebody into slavery. So unlike other definitions in the U.S., no movement of the worker is necessary for there to be human trafficking. So next slide, the first law that we'll discuss is the California Transparency and Supply Chains Act. It's been around for a couple of years, but let's look first what businesses are required to comply. Any company that is a retailer or manufacturer with annual gross worldwide receipts exceeding $100 million and who is doing business in California must comply with the statute. And doing business is really a low threshold. It's basically if you have property or salaries in the state which exceeds $50,000. So, one employee, maybe some equipment makes you qualified. So those companies who are required to report must have a disclosure statement on their company website with a link prominently displayed on their homepage. So what's required are 5 disclosure topics. And each one has to be addressed in the statement, and they're basically these 5. First, do you verify your supply chain to evaluate and address risks of human trafficking and slavery? Number 2, do you audit suppliers? As Phil just mentioned, it may not be effective, but do you audit suppliers to evaluate compliance with your standards? And if you do, are they unannounced and are they done by third parties? Third, do you obtain certification from direct suppliers that materials that are in your goods, do they comply with local anti-trafficking and slavery laws? 4, do you maintain internal accountability standards for those in your organization who fail to meet your standards? And 5th, what training do you provide to your employees and management who have supply chain responsibility? Now, again, this is purely a reporting statute, so you don't have to do these things. It's actually very, it's fine, at least for purposes of the statute, to just say, hey, we don't do any of these things. And you say, we don't do number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. For purposes of fulfilling the requirements of the statute, you're good. So I want to compare that with the next law, which is the next slide, the UK Modern Slavery Act. So this actually went into effect last year, although only recently are people starting to report. The UK Act applies to what businesses? Okay, comparing to California, let's go through this. First, it's any company that carries on business either totally or even in part in any part of the United Kingdom. Number 2, the company must supply goods or services, and compared it with the California Act, which was limited to retailers and manufacturers. Here, any company who supplies goods or services, so it's a much larger net. And third, the company must have a total turnover of no less than 36 million pounds. And the California Act was $100 million. I remember when this first came in, I looked up what 36 million pounds was. It was roughly 57, 58 million dollars, and now it's, I think, closer to $48 million. So companies who are half the size of those required to report in California must report under the UK Act. So the Act actually requires a statement of the steps that the company has taken during the past financial year to ensure that slavery and human trafficking have not taken place in any of the company's supply chains or in any part of its business. Now, the alternative is to just say, hey, you know what? We've taken no steps. Again, it's a reporting statute saying what you've done. Now, unlike California, where there are 5 areas that you must report, the UK Act says, okay, your statement, again, linked to your homepage, it must capture it actually just suggests 6 topics. And these are not required, it's just a suggestion. So those 6 are, 1, a description of the company's structure, its business and supply chain. Number 2, what policies it has regarding slavery and human trafficking. 3, what due diligence it's taken regarding slavery and addressing human trafficking in both the business and its supply chains. Number 4, if there is a risk of slavery, what it's been to assess and manage that risk. And what is the 5th requirement is what is been the effectiveness of ensuring that slavery and human trafficking is not taking place in the business or the supply chains. And lastly, what training is being performed. All right, so what is unique about this act is that it requires a certain level of accountability, and that is companies must have their statements approved by the board of directors and actually signed by a director. And if you're a limited liability partnership, the members must approve the statement and it must be signed by a designated member. Other partnerships must get a general partner signature. So there's going to be a much higher scrutiny here. Now, all that being said, a recent study by, and this I think the next slide, the Core Coalition in Business and Human Rights Resource Center found that of the 75 statements that were analyzed, only 22 were both signed by a director and available on the from a link on the website's homepage. 33 of them were not signed by a director. 33 had no link to the homepage, and only 9 statements covered all 6 of the recommended areas of information. So let's go to the 3rd of our 4th set of laws, and this is the U.S. Federal Acquisition Regulations. And there's actually 2 that we're going to discuss very quickly. The first is revisions to the FAR entitled Combating Trafficking in Persons, and the second one is actually a new federal acquisition regulation entitled Certification Regarding Trafficking in Persons Compliance Plan. So previously, what existed were regulations which prohibited contractors from engaging in human trafficking, from procuring commercial sex acts, and from using forced labor. But the new requirements expressly prohibit these, what they call trafficking-related activities. So destroying or denying employees access to their identification documents, such as passports and licenses, using misleading or fraudulent employment recruiting practices, charging employees recruitment fees, failing to pay return transportation costs back to people's home countries when their work is finished, and providing housing that is below host country standards. And if required by law, the failure to provide employment contracts or other worker documentation in the language understood by the workers. So those are now each expressly prohibited. And in addition, contractors and subcontractors must agree to fully cooperate with the federal agencies responsible for audits, investigations, corrective actions, and each contractor must inform the contracting officer of any critical information it receives that it has, or its subcontractors or employees or their agents that engage in any of these trafficking-related activities. So 2 last points here. For government contracts and subcontracts greater than $500,000 to be formed outside of the United States, there must be a certification and compliance plan to prevent these activities, and the companies must implement procedures to prevent the activities and must perform due diligence such that there be no such activities. If any of these activities are found, though, there must be some remedial and referral actions. Each year, contractors, subcontractors must certify that they have these plans, and they found nothing, or they've done something about the things they found. And those apply to these large contracts other than commercially available off-the-shelf items. So let me very quickly go through the last of the 4 laws, and that is the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act, which is our next slide. actually amended the Tariff Act of 1930 and establishes new procedures for U.S. Customs Border Protection to investigate whether goods coming into the country have been produced by prison or forced labor. Let me skip a little bit here and just say that, look, this is now shows much greater enforcement in the past 85 years than 40 instances of goods being stopped into the country. And now, in the last few months, I've read about 3 or 4 times where goods have been stopped because of suspicion they've been made with either forced or prison labor. And the last thing I wanted to mention was that the Trade Enforcement Task Force has been created, and they're the ones charged with doing much more of this investigation and enforcement. So that's what I have now. I know it's very fast, and please send questions if you have any. And I think I'm supposed to hand over now to Mike McDonald from Intel. And so, Mike, this is yours.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, glad to be here. Good chance for us to share a little bit what we're doing, but also to say, as such a large problem that forced and bonded labor is and human trafficking, we are continuing to learn. So what I want to share here is where we're at today, and it's a journey for us. We want to continue to do better, continue to have a positive impact on the lives of the workers in the supply chain, and hopefully we will continue to do that as we kind of pick up and learn more things. So what I want to go through first is a bit of our current process. And then I will share just a few kind of best practices. So this will go relatively quickly. I know we're kind of running out of time a little bit here. The first thing to do, and it's part of what I think Phil had on his page there. There's kind of a recipe of things you can do, and any one of them isn't going to solve it. But the process starts with establishing clear expectations, and I'll show you a little bit more about what those are for us and for most of the people in the industry. Then you have to spend a lot of time on the next couple of boxes, capacity building or capability building, as some people call it. Really spending time with our suppliers has been a focus of the last 6 to 9 months. We tended to kind of jump to the audit process a little bit ahead further down the process, but in the last, like I say, 6 to 9 months, we've identified a group of suppliers that we thought were at higher risk and spent a considerable amount of time working with them almost in a kind of one-on-one capacity to help them understand what our expectations were, why it was important to treat the workers differently, and how that will benefit both of us from a business and as well as human rights standpoint. Short of that, a normal process is going to include some level of risk assessment, and I think Jeff is going to get into that next a little bit, so I won't belabor that too much. But then, I don't disagree with my colleague Phil here that audits are not the sole solution, but we do think they have a place eventually if done right. Audits have to be managed and planned and executed properly for them to really uncover the issues. So you can't kind of go in and do a standard walk around a factory and expect to uncover whether workers have paid fees back in their home country and whether they got a contract in their own language and whether or not they're in debt. That's not going to tell you that. You're going to have to create a different type of audit, and the electronic industry has been working on that for the last several years, and I think we're getting better at with some good help from good audit firms out there in the world. And then finally, it kind of takes persistence. Gap closing, this last piece is one of the hardest things to kind of hold and be resolute in ensuring that once you uncover a problem, and again, I agree with Phil, it's out there. If you're not finding things, you're not looking hard enough, and it's sad to find it, but it's also comforting to know that we're making a difference and sticking with those suppliers, working with them if they're committed to fix the problem means that you've got a chance to have a positive impact on the workers. So those are our major steps, and I'd say we continue to refine them. There's challenges throughout. None of this is easy. It's a problem we have to all go work on, but as you jump into it, be aware that it takes a good time commitment, but it is important. There's challenges in getting through the tiers of the supply chain, as was mentioned earlier. And then I will say, given it's an issue that's really only kind of come into almost a perfect storm in the last couple of years, I think we're all still getting clear on a consistent message on what our expectations are. Briefly on the next page, we listen to a lot of NGOs, watching the government regulations come about, thinking about what we wanted for ourselves and our employees and our supply chain. And 3 years ago, we built this list of things that we expect in our supply chain. There's always a bunch of forbidden activities, but then you can't forget the last couple things around making sure that there's good ongoing monitoring that is in place within our group that looks out at our supply chain, and then now educating the suppliers on how to do that for themselves and how they look down into their supply chain as well. I am happy to say that the electronic industry through the EICC has instituted most of these changes now, and we've got a very strong code of conduct that's setting a pretty high bar for all of us that we're working towards. So that's helping. At the same time, there's headwinds. A lot of governments allow fees and levies to be charged to workers. Some of the definitions we talk in are very difficult for people to understand, and so we've still got some things and some work to do to kind of make this more obvious, I think, to people that it should not be taking place, some of these practices, but I think we're starting to make progress. I mentioned capacity building or capability building is key. You can't just jump to the audit, and it's just one page out of some training material that we use when we sit down with our suppliers that you probably want to think about developing, or if you're interested, I'm happy to talk and share some of this. But having good sets of material, walking through expectations, helping suppliers understand what good looks like. You can't just tell them what not to do. You have to help them, and we find that's best when you help them understand what is possible, what good looks like, what you've seen elsewhere, what are those best practices, in order to kind of help slowly change the culture, because that's one of the big challenges. This has kind of been a normal course of business. In our case, what we see a lot of is recruiting violations where workers are having to pay labor agents, labor brokers to get their job. And that's been great for suppliers because they don't have to pay to staff and do that staffing. They've effectively outsourced that, and therefore you're having this culture change that's going to mean a change to their business model in some regard, and you've got to kind of work with them to help them through that, and that takes that one-on-one engagement. It's new for them. It's new for their procurement people. It's new for their human resources people. But if you can give examples, if you can sit down with them, we find that people will come around and they will see the benefit of changing. The last thing that we do, sometimes you leave a supplier and they're feeling overwhelmed by all of this, and we try and leave them with a bit of a suggested next steps, right? How to kind of take the bite off the bite off of a corner somewhere to begin their process. And so we leave them something like this that tries to talk them through some of the steps they might take, and then remind them that just as important as their material suppliers are, their labor providers, their manpower providers, the people that they work with to bring staff on board, those suppliers are strategic. And if they begin to think of them in that way, we find that that's one of the ways to kind of turn the corner and break through and get people to realize, as we often say, our people are our greatest assets. Well, let's make sure we think about that up front in the process when people are coming on board. With that, I will turn it over to Jeff, who I believe is going to take us through some work and some ideas around using data analytics.
Great, thanks, Michael. Moving the slide ahead. Okay. So when we think about risk of human trafficking in the supply chain, we have to think about all the different kinds of risks. Sure, there's the ethical issues, but beyond the ethical issues that are obvious and that have been covered on the call so far, there are a number of other kinds of risks, most of which are listed here. I mean, what's the financial risk attached to each import container, and what does it mean for our business if it gets turned around by customs? And how difficult would it be to change suppliers or start up a new facility if one gets shut down due to slavery? So you can see risk is significant. It's an important problem to solve, and companies are facing a wide range of these listed here. One of the things that we at D&B do is we talk to a lot of different customers, and what we found in those discussions is that most companies, when they're trying to solve the human trafficking problem, are in one of four different buckets of readiness, and we've listed them here, everything ranging from having no program in place all the way up to the use of analytics. And really the goal is to have the ability to detect the widest range of risk possible and get continuous information, not episodic snapshots that may come in annual site visits alone or certifications. And most of the best-in-class companies that we're talking to use a combination of internal and external data sources that enable them to go beyond merely looking at just their Tier 1 suppliers, but looking at a breadth of other areas where there's hidden risks, such as the sub-tier, corporate families, et cetera. And that combination of techniques all the way up this curve acts together to minimize the risk. There really is no silver bullet. This particular slide really is just talking about the fact that site visits alone, you can't visit every site constantly, and it's impractical to get to all of them. Just like relying on surveys alone really is a risky and practical endeavor. So what we're seeing is that companies are using analytics to get a more complete understanding of the human trafficking risk throughout the supply chain and gain visibility into areas where they normally wouldn't be able to see that have known risk. An example, if we look at this visibility barrier, you'll see that there are four type areas of hidden risk, and I'll go through each one of these. The first one being Tier 1 supplier risk, then within the corporate family, the sub-tier, and the changes that inevitably occur in the supply chain. So this first example is the recognition of the fact that the use of suppliers is really such that you only see what the supplier provides you or the country that that supplier is located in. You actually miss all the other lines of businesses that the supplier's in and the location, some of which could be actually very risky. So the lack of visibility into the total business and location set of the supplier is something that we're seeing as one of the major visibility barriers, and overcoming that is what companies are seeking to do. The second type risk is supplier corporate family risk, and what this is the recognition that there's some members of suppliers' corporate families are actually very risky. They're located in risky countries, and the combination of the country and the commodity that they provide is a high propensity for human trafficking. And within the corporate family, oftentimes there are internal transfers of goods and services that aren't apparent. This is a case of Kroger, who was doing business with a U.S.-based seafood company, that provided chicken of the sea, which by all means wasn't risky in and of themselves based on location and what they did, but they had a risky corporate family member who transferred tainted shrimp from a factory in Malaysia where they were using shrimp slaves. The next example is a more recent example where stevia, which is a sweetener from a company called Pure Circle, was confiscated by the U.S. Customs. And for the past month, there's been a question of whether or not that stevia was provided by forced labor in China by the supplier that you can see off to the right. And just yesterday, it was determined that that was not the case. But for the past month, there's been a lot of bad press. Everybody knows that Coca-Cola got their their stevia from Pure Circle, and it was all in question, and the ingredients were held up at the port. So you can see just being accused of slavery in the supply chain can cause an awful lot of disruption. And what really helped Pure Circle in this case was the fact that they had the right documentation and were able to relatively efficiently prove that they weren't using that supplier. But in the case of Coca-Cola, they had no visibility into who the sub-tier supplier was at all. And then finally, in terms of the visibility barrier, it's the visibility issue that changes do occur over time. And listed here are all the kinds of changes that happen in the supply base that can affect risk and propensity for human trafficking. Supply base, you're introduced with new commodities, some of which are risky, new suppliers, new locations, sub-tiers changing, country risk levels are changing. Just yesterday, the State Department changed the risk level of the country, Myanmar, to the riskiest based on what they were doing there around trafficking. And so Dun & Bradstreet's developed a solution that really is designed to fill in the gaps of where that hidden risk is. It's designed to complement the existing approaches companies that take. It's an analytics platform that's based on both D&B's proprietary database, which is the largest supplier database in the world of 250 million suppliers, combined both with the State Department and the Labor Affairs Bureau's databases. And basically the way it works in the remaining time that we have is that customers will provide us with a master file from their ERP system, and very quickly we can score each one of the suppliers, the family members, and if you have sub-tier, we can score that as well and provide back a flat file to you with all the different scores, a 1 to a 7 rating, 1 being the least risky, 7 being the highest propensity for human trafficking in the supply chain, and score that so that you can better prioritize your efforts and look for opportunities to mitigate risk. These are the 3 components of the platform. I won't go into these in the interest of time, but know that matching is a key part of this, understanding who the supplier is, enriching the supplier with the family entities and all the locations and commodities that they provide, and then being able to layer on those proprietary analytics so that one can score the information. And the benefits are what I just said before: reducing risk, creating process efficiencies, and being able to do this continuously so you can monitor for change, and then providing a measurable assessment of the risk so that you can document the effectiveness of your program over time, should you need it. So in summary, human trafficking in the supply chain really is a reality. Companies are under increasing scrutiny from consumers. The trend is towards more legislation, as Paul talked about. In detecting human trafficking, there are no silver bullets, but companies can make steady progress by fully understanding the law and developing a comprehensive program in place that sometimes can be policies and training, but for sure should include a holistic approach to detection involving analytics and third-party data, because it can make a big difference. And D&B has a solution that can help with this, as well as a supply chain mapping solution where we can auto-map a supply chain and then layer on the risk scores. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Venus for the remaining portion of the presentation.
Venus? Wow.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, we can hear you now. Go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me on to talk a little bit more about what Not for Sale's been doing as far as combining business and really using it as a way to fund the service that needs to happen with survivors. So I think we talked enough. The first slide that I just skipped by was talking a little bit more deeper about what human trafficking is, but for the sake of time, I feel like that's been covered already. I wanted to immediately dive into what the exploiters are looking for and what type of young people that I have seen actually getting caught up. A lot of times exploiters come in all shapes and sizes. It could be family, friends, or a stranger. And usually they use the vulnerability point of a young person trying to get their basic needs met, whether that be food, clothes, shelter, any kind of chemical dependence. These things are definitely taken advantage of in the exploiter and survivor relationship. And usually the trauma that's caused by the traffickers is so great that a lot of young women don't even understand. I say young women because that's who I work with primarily, and a lot of them don't even understand that they're in an exploitive situation due to the trauma and due to things such as Stockholm Syndrome. Some of the ways we've seen sex trafficking happening here in the Bay Area has been, the list is provided on the right, private parties, gang-based prostitution, escort services, internet-based, street-based. I think a lot of times people just think of it as being street-based, but we have definitely seen it in all shapes and forms, including even interfamiliar pimping as well as stripping and online porno sites. Also forced labor, sourcing, mining, manufacturing, child labor, and military, and I want to thank you all for adding that into the slide. We're seeing that this is definitely an issue that's global, affecting over 30 million people with the potential of making up to $32 billion. So it's definitely big business for an exploiter to exploit the survivors that I know what you've come into contact with. Our founder, who is David Batstone, actually went into a restaurant that he liked to go to, Indian restaurant, and found out that teenagers were actually being labor trafficked in, and wanted to explore the issue a little bit more, and eventually ended up writing a book called Not for Sale, which launched the organization Not for Sale, which is now a global anti-trafficking organization working within 6 different countries. So our goal essentially is to protect people and communities around the world from modern-day slavery and human trafficking. The experience that I speak to today on the panel is more around the sex trafficking of young women, but Not for Sale works with young women as well as young males. And the issue that I just want to point out is there's just not enough documentation and data about what's going on with the young men. We find that there's more data around what's going on with the young women, so it's a severe challenge that we have had, being able to identify more what's going on with the boys, how are they being trafficked, what has been the long-term impact. We're actually embarking on starting a new organization in Vietnam, working with some of the street boys that have been trafficking online, actually via Facebook, and that should be launching within the next year or so, trying to help them establish essentially kind of like the work readiness program we do here, which I'll talk about in a little bit, as well as a drop-in center for the street kids. Not only do we provide work readiness, but we also work to help get shelter, health care, legal services, education, job and life skills and training, so that they're able to actually see a pathway out of this life. So as I said earlier, we have projects in Romania, Vietnam, Amsterdam, United States, Thailand, Amazon, Peru, Sweden, because this is an issue that definitely crosses globally. But what we're seeing here in California, which is actually ranked among the top 13 places for sexual exploitation of children, that 43% of that is happening here, right here in the Bay Area, San Francisco. So it's almost like wherever you see, large amounts of money or huge events, we're also seeing that match with the spike in sexual exploitation of young people. I think what's so unique about Not for Sale is that they find, here we go. My apologies with the slide. They find innovative ways to continue to support the critical services that survivors need globally. So by engaging businesses that fight human trafficking around the world, they've created stuff like a soup, this soup is Not for Sale, it's called. Love the branding. I think the branding of Not for Sale has definitely helped with the mission. But creating a soup, creating Rebel, which is a tonic that they came up with in order to get the word out about human trafficking as well as raise funds to support the services. And how we engage with businesses is we go in, we raise awareness among the employees who do on educations and trainings, as well as making sure to label all of our products with pieces around what is the supply chain on this? Where did it come from? Where did the ingredients come from? And who is this actually going to support? And so if you look up Free to Work, that's kind of like our website where if folks have any questions about the consumers that they buy from, if they have forced or child labor, they could go on this website, type in a name, and find out what their supply chain looks like. We also engage businesses with volunteer days and bring them in to knock for sale and have them assist us with some of the projects. Sometimes it feels like this creates more of that ownership when they get to do that hands-on work and help spread the word even faster. So really briefly, over our time since we started in 2007, we've been able to serve over 10,000 survivors. We're actually going to, like I told you earlier, we're going to be embarking on starting a new project in Vietnam that we're excited about. I just came back from Amsterdam where we have a restaurant that has been making a considerable amount of money, as well as training young women directly out of the windows in Amsterdam to be chefs and cooks, to make that very not-for-sale soup that I had mentioned earlier. And so we're seeing this as a key way to do jobs and on-site training as a way to get these young women out of the life. A lot of times they're not presented with those kind of opportunities, so they don't know that that's an option. So we had to start by bringing the soup to them. Then they said, well, how do we make the soup? And now we started a full-on program in Amsterdam that's similar to the one we're doing here in the Bay Area, where I basically train young women 18 to 24 who identify as being survivors and work readiness skills. And we talk about the trauma. We talk about the healing component that needs to happen, as well as give them the tools that really equip them to get employment. I think a lot of times that's where folks that fall short. Maybe they'll give them a quick workshop. But we try and go much deeper into what their experience has been being a survivor of sexual exploitation, and what is it going to take to get over those obstacles and barriers in order to get you employment. We've been really successful. After 2 years, we've been able to access 100 young women and train and equip 75 of those girls. I think that's it for me. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Venus. We really appreciate it. Thank you to all the presenters and all the attendees. What we will do is we will send out answers to the questions as well as the slide deck and a link to the presentation following this call. If you have additional questions, we will include contact information there for the presenters.